Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. So Captain America and Iron Man are characters who are often talked about together since Civil War happened. However, I think people generally overlook that they've had intersecting character arcs across movies since even before that, and that they've been informing each other's characters as early as the Avengers film, the first one. And so I decided to make a video exploring that. I'm probably not the first person to think about this. I'm probably not the first person to discuss it in some manner, but I wanted to talk about it, so I am. It is 6:30 in the morning. I have been awake since yesterday. I decided I really wanted to finish this video, so I did, except for the intro, which I have just done. So, video start, please, so that I can sleep. Please.
This film wasn't the first released, but it does feature the earliest story in the timeline, so we're gonna start here. Steve Rogers begins as a scrawny kid from Brooklyn with an intense desire to do his part, to work toward a common good. He doesn't need to be the best, he doesn't need to be in charge or in power, he simply wants to do anything he can to help.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies.
As a result of his good character, he ends up a test subject for a special serum that turns him into a superhuman soldier. A kindly older foreign man acts as a surrogate father figure and promptly dies in order to give him proper pathos. And then he beats up a Nazi. So, how is he enlisted to help once he develops these amazing abilities? He's used to sell war bonds, which puts him in the same company as Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck when it comes to the war effort. But Steve doesn't complain. Helping is helping, right? However, when he's sent to perform for the troops, presumably to boost morale, he finds that he's not helping them at all. Not even a little. They kind of hate him, actually. What he's doing feels real hollow, and particularly in this moment, he doesn't feel like he's doing anything of value for the war effort. So, when he hears that some POWs need help, he intentionally disobeys orders to go rescue them. Partially for his own sake, I think, but also partially because he knows that he can help in ways that nobody else can. And if he can help, I mean, he needs to. It's almost like with great power comes great responsibility or something, but I don't know, that's stupid. Anyway, his single-handed assault and rescue is successful, and from then on, he's seen as a real asset to the war. From here, he serves as both a practical asset and a boost for morale, both on the front and at home. He creates a band of elite soldiers, including his best friend. He has a budding romance with a fellow soldier named Bucky. And also has a thing with Peggy Carter, I guess. Bucky dies, Steve can't get drunk because he's too cool, and he also meets some guy named Howard Stark who doesn't really seem that important, but he makes Steve a cool, unbreakable shield, but again, probably not important. At the end of the film, he ends up sacrificing himself in order to save others, because above all else, it's not about him. He just wants to help as many people as he can, however he can. And he dies. Except no, he doesn't. 70 years later, he wakes up in modern-day New York and is like...
I had a date.
He's talking about Peggy there, not Bucky. Tony Stark is the genius son of, oh hey, that unimportant guy from before. What a neat, extremely insignificant Easter egg. He owns a weapons manufacturing company called Stark Industries and is very good at creating ways to kill as many people as possible for the low price of a couple mil. He's a ladies' man, he's an inventor, he's handsome, he's charming, he's a prick. Then he gets blowed up.
By now you may wonder how I wound up here.
As a result, he has to wear a magnet on his chest so he won't die, but he builds a way better, cooler magnet that glows and breaks the laws of known science because he's just so damn smart and cool. Also, a kindly older foreign man acts as a surrogate father figure and promptly dies in order to give him proper pathos. And Tony responds by blowing up all the guys who blowed him up, and then going home. After seeing the human cost of participating in the military-industrial complex and feeling super guilty about it, he decides to stop making weapons for other people, and instead only make weapons for himself so that he can decide who deserves to be blowed up instead, because he's a hero. Tony, unlike Steve, is very much an egotist. It's important to him that he is the person helping. He lives in a world where he has always been the most competent and important person in the room, and as such only trusts himself to decide how to do things. Also, unlike Steve, Tony is reacting to a world that he knows he has actively made worse. He becomes a superhero out of guilt and a desire to redeem himself. He's trying to buy back karma points however he can, because to Tony Stark, everything can be bought, including being a good person. Steve, however, lived in a world where an external force was making the world worse, and he became a superhero just out of a sense of duty. Very different people with very different upbringings in completely different eras made heroes due to very different circumstances. And for our purposes, this is all the important stuff in the movie. After this big initial change, he doesn't really change much in this film. The only important thing at the end is that when he's asked to maintain a secret identity, he instead loudly proclaims himself to be Iron Man like the egotistical glory hog he is. After all, he's becoming a hero to redeem himself, and to a person like Tony, he can only be redeemed through external validation. That's all he's known his entire life as a prodigy in the public eye, and that's what his father denied him before he died. Tony has a deep-seated desire to be liked and appreciated. Also, he has daddy issues. Tony doesn't really change in this movie at all, so for our purposes, this film may as well not exist. I mean, as a movie, it kind of just existed to have Tony sort of run in place as a character for a while until the Avengers happened. Speaking of which, our two boys finally meet each other, and they don't get along at all. Their first meeting is when they face off with Loki. Steve shows up just in the nick of time in his new, very silly-looking Captain America outfit and talks about how he punched Hitler in the goddamn face after saving a Holocaust survivor from being murdered. You know, it's all heroic and stuff, like in a traditional Superman sense. Soon after, Tony shows up, complete with his own theme music blaring. He just showboats like a motherfucker. They spend the movie clashing for reasons I've already covered. They're simply very different people with very different outlooks on life due to their individual circumstances. Also, Tony just has a very fragile ego. At one point, Tony shows up and just figuratively spits in the face of authority by hacking into S.H.I.E.L.D. in order to figure out what they're hiding. Steve finds this lack of trust in authority upsetting. He's a man who actively shed his individualism in order to work toward a greater good, while Tony excessively flaunts his individualism. That said, Tony does uncover some stuff that makes Steve question who he's working with. They nearly come to blows when the magic staff of MacGuffin pulls a one ring on them and makes everybody grumpy. But even in this distorted emotional state, Steve would never fight Tony without his suit.
Put on the suit. Let's go a few rounds.
Because, that wouldn't be a fair fight. Plus, he might kill him if he did that, so, However, stuff happens, nerds die, Hulk smash, and eventually Tony learns how to trust Steve and take orders from him like a good team player. And in the end, Tony decides to take a page out of Steve's book and sacrifice himself for the greater good when the government decides to shoot a nuclear missile at New York. But Hulk just yells at him and he's good. Except no, he isn't. Tony is suffering from PTSD, and while he's more selfless now, he's also super paranoid and acting erratic because he doesn't know how to deal with mental illness. Tony is a man who has felt in control his entire life, and now he's lost that sense of control. This movie shows that he's been making like a bajillion Iron Man suits, and there's a reason for this. The suit makes him feel powerful, makes him feel safe, in control, and making them gives him a sense of control. I mean, hell, at one point he very literally gets triggered and has a panic attack, and the first thing he does is get into his suit, and he eventually calms down. You could say it's his safe space, a real thing that some people need sometimes. However, in this specific case for Tony, it's being used as a crutch and is also straining his relationship with Pepper. In the film, he eventually learns how to cope with his feelings of powerlessness. But what he really should have done is, see a therapist, because his issues have not been fully dealt with. Meanwhile, Cap undergoes his own identity crisis. Now, Steve obviously rubbed off on Tony, but, Tony rubbed off on Steve just as much. Take that however you will. Steve is obviously less blindly trusting of authority as he was before. When Tony hacked S.H.I.E.L.D., he uncovered some shady shit, and the missile Tony risked his life redirecting was fired due to the orders of higher authorities who seem to, run the world or something. Those people have never been fully... Who are these people? Who are they? Anyway, Steve has every reason to want to hold authority morally accountable. These feelings are proven justified when S.H.I.E.L.D. turns on him and is revealed to have been infiltrated by Hydra agents as a direct result of the less than moral actions of Steve's own friends back in the good old days. Specifically hiring Nazi/Hydra scientist Armin Zola rather than, locking him up and throwing away the key. Also, there's a quick bit where we see Hydra orchestrated the death of Howard Stark, Tony's dad, but, they don't really draw much attention to it, so it's just another small Easter egg, it doesn't matter. Amidst all this disillusionment, he's also dealing with the knowledge that Peggy Carter, while alive, is no longer fully there, and clearly not long for this world. Steve's losing all his old friends. However, his other beau, Bucky, is alive and young. Yay! But he's also a brainwashed assassin, so that part's not as good. Oh no. And it's here we see that Captain America is still very different from Iron Man. Even when he doesn't trust authorities and institutions, he still has unshakable faith in other individuals. It's not all about him, and it's not all on his shoulders. That's never been how he's approached things. And his faith in other people is rewarded with loyalty from the people around him. Steve is, at heart, a team player, a leader, as opposed to Tony's consistent idea that he alone can and should solve all the problems. In the end, Steve kinda unbrainwashes Bucky through the power of friendship, and dismantles S.H.I.E.L.D. also through the power of friendship and speeches. The subtitle of this movie could be Tony Fucks Up Big Time, because, yeah, he does. In this film, we learn that Tony has been trying to find a way to basically automate being an Avenger so his friends no longer have to be put in danger. He saw an army in space that he knows is coming, and he can't let go of the idea that if he and he alone does not do something, everybody is going to die. As a result, he ends up creating a sentient machine named Ultron who, kind of goes rogue and ends up flattening a small country. And two of the other villains of the movie, who turn into heroes by the end, are also the way they are, specifically because of Tony's past of, selling weapons and stuff. And yeah, this is a movie where Tony discovers that he can't escape the fact that he hurts people, even when he's trying to help people. He thought that he alone was the answer, but he keeps getting in over his head and making problems worse, again and again. And, of course, all of this comes to a head in this film. Tony, after facing down an angry and bereaved mother, has now fully convinced himself that he was wrong to trust himself to be the end-all be-all judge of what's best. At this point, the evidence has shown him that every time he intervenes to fix things on his own, he makes problems worse. So he makes a choice. He, and by extension all the Avengers, needs oversight. So in come the Sokovia Accords, created to ensure that the Avengers have to answer to a higher authority. However, at this point, Steve has learned the opposite lesson from Tony. He's learned that institutions aren't to be trusted, and that only individuals are worthy of the faith needed to trust someone to have his back in protecting the world. These people, who began their journeys a certain way due to individual circumstances, have now flipped positions due to, once again, individual circumstances. However, throughout all of this, their core motivations have never changed. Steve still believes in working toward the greater good, and while his trust is in individuals, it's not in himself as the individual. And Tony is still desperate to redeem himself, but now he's simply realizing the flaws in his attempts at redemption before. He's driven once again by guilt to attempt to make things right, this time rejecting the old way he thought he should do things. Nothing has changed, and yet, everything has. At the end of this film, it's revealed that the Hydra agent who killed Tony's mom and dad was, in fact, a brainwashed Bucky. Steve appeals to Tony's logic, noting that Bucky had no control over his actions and would never knowingly do something like that, but Tony is, at heart, an emotionally broken person.
I don't care. He killed my mom.
Steve and Tony face off, resulting in Steve disabling Tony's suit so that he can no longer fight.
That shield doesn't belong to you. My father made that shield.
Steve seems to, on some level, think Tony is right. He overlooked what happened to one of his friends in order to protect another. So he drops his shield, symbolically giving up the mantle of Captain America. The film ends with the fundamental differences between these two characters fracturing the Avengers. Very few are left with Tony after this, the majority having sided with Steve in the end. The fact is, Tony isn't a leader. Steve is. He inspires loyalty from people because he's just as loyal to them in return. Tony is acting on what he honestly believes is right, but in an ultimately selfish way. His support of the Accords was in order to shift responsibility and therefore blame from the Avengers and, more importantly, himself. He's trying to escape the guilt, but the guilt just keeps piling up. However, in the middle of this movie, I overlooked something. Tony meets a kid named Peter Parker, and oddly enough, Peter is an almost perfect mix between Steve and Tony. He's got Tony's guilt due to the death of his uncle, but he's also got this unbreakable moral code that motivates him to do everything he can to help people as long as he has the power to.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
Tony takes Peter under his wing in this film. He sees something in Peter, something that makes the kid better than himself. He wants to foster that, help create a hero who can outshine him. And this includes creating consequences when Peter makes the same mistakes Tony would. Consequences are something Tony never had to face, and that stunted his development as a person. Is this kind of hypocritical? Maybe. But Peter's potential is irrefutable, and Tony is trying his damnedest to ensure that he lives up to it. And Tony thinks this is his job, because one thing Tony still has not figured out yet is that it's not all up to him.
And if you die, I feel like that's on me.
At the end of this film, Tony tries to give Peter what he knows he would have wanted. Fame, recognition, status, but Peter refuses it. The part of Peter that's reminiscent of Steve wins out, the part of him that sees being Spider-Man as a duty and responsibility, not a road to personal glory. It actually seems to hurt Tony's feelings a bit when Peter denies his offer to join the Avengers. But he's also proud of him. And now we get to the most recent film to feature these characters. Tony has spent his time being a paternal figure for Peter and trying to keep what's left of the Avengers afloat. He hasn't really done a great job. I mean, there's only 3 left, and Vision has gone AWOL, so that's 1/3 just gone, disappeared. Tony once again attempts to take everything upon himself,
Gotta get that stone out of here now.
It stays with me.
Exactly. Bye.
attempting to face down Thanos with as few potential casualties as possible. Of course, Peter stows away, infuriating and obviously worrying Tony. After trying and failing to be a real leader, he and his team fail to stop Thanos from getting the Time Stone. Meanwhile, Steve has been taking care of the majority of the Avengers off the grid, serving as a paternal figure for all of them and treating the Avengers as his family. Steve's dedication to individuals supersedes his duty to the greater good in this film, however, when he refuses to allow Vision to simply be destroyed in order to keep Thanos from the power he needs to wipe out half the universe. His own failure to lead pragmatically ends in them failing entirely. Thanos, with a snap of his fingers, beats both Tony and Steve. Tony watches all of his companions, and eventually Peter, disappear.
If you die, I feel like that's on me.
He sits on an alien planet, completely isolated due to his own choices and actions. Steve watches Bucky and the other Avengers dissolve into thin air, surrounded by a broken family he failed to protect. And that's where Infinity War leaves their stories. Both Steve and Tony failed as leaders on their own, and each of their failures resulted in Thanos winning.
So, why did I make this video? Mainly, I just wanted to show, in a small way, what I believe to be the big strength of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because frankly, Marvel's individual films aren't amazing. Relatively few are even something I'd personally consider to be all that good, besides being a passable time in a movie theater. The thing that personally keeps me coming back to these films, despite the very real superhero fatigue I've felt on multiple occasions over the years, is the journeys of characters like Tony Stark and Steve Rogers over the course of overlapping and yet individually contained films, which, whether anyone likes it or not, is a unique experience that hasn't even been approached by anyone else in the film industry. And I personally believe this is the only thing keeping Marvel films engaging and relevant on the whole at all. I have fun during them, but I would have been done by now if I weren't actually invested in these characters. These characters have obviously had individual journeys over the course of these films, but many, including these two in particular, have had overlapping character arcs informed by each other. These characters have changed one another in ways that can only be seen by taking in the big picture, rather than discussing the individual films in a vacuum. And so I made this video to express that thought. And now I have done that, which means the video is over.